Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I was muted, of course, because that's how it is for 2022. 2021, I don't even know what year it is. We're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. First, thank you all for joining us. Hope you're having a great close to the end of the year. I'm going to go over some housekeeping and then we'll go ahead and get the webinar started. So we have at the bottom, since this is the webinar, we have a Q&A and a chat box. Feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A and not the chat box. The chat box, feel free to put your comments, any resources, thoughts. We welcome you to please engage as much as you can in this webinar. So I'm very excited to introduce my co-panelist, Vanessa Wakeman, who is the CEO and founder of the Wakeman Agency, which is a fantastic firm that we've done research with, and they focus on assisting a lot of nonprofits with some of their social justice work. As Pat Ford says, yay, Vanessa. So yay, Vanessa, for that. And she's been a wonderful partner for us and a good friend of mine personally. So I'm very excited to introduce her today as we do this fireside chat. So this is based on a report that IPR did with the Wakeman Agency, focused on the language of diversity. And it focuses on how communication leaders are defining and discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations. It was something that we saw was missing from the literature, and we worked on thinking about how language is used and the impact of language. So let's go ahead and get started with the fireside chat. I feel like, Vanessa, we should have had like fires in the back, like a nice little, fireplace or something in the background, but we're just going to have to do with the walls that we've been given. All right. So
next time we'll be in front of our fireplaces with some brandy.
Please. I so look forward to that day. But this study that we did is based on a survey of almost 400 communication professionals. And we conducted it from March and April of this year. And what was really important to both of us was the combination of qualitative and quantitative. So we asked the survey questions, so we have that nice data, but we also asked a lot of open-ended questions to find out why and how people are doing what they do. So we will drop a link to that study in the chat. But please, this is an open forum, so please feel free to ask any questions that you have. All right, so you ready to get started, Vanessa?
I am ready. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. Okay, so first the whole point of today is really to talk about your reaction to some of the research findings. But let's back up and talk about what was really important to you about this study and why we did this study.
Sure. So I think last year we started to see a lot of conversations happening about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what was going well and what wasn't. And in some of those conversations, just observations of how people were misunderstanding what DEI was, not really clear, not sure and hesitant about the language. And so I wanted to sort of think through, as the communicators who have a responsibility for like shaping narratives and responsibility and oversight for language, what is the role that we should be playing in one, understanding what DEI is, talking about it, actioning it, and then sort of framing it or weaving it into all of the communications. And so when I approached you about it, my thinking was, we need to find out what people know and what they don't know, because I think that will help to hold a mirror up to the industry and really support us in moving toward the next steps and really having at least, I don't know if we need to sort of focus on a universal definition, but at least some foundational best practices or agreement on, at the very least, it means this, and then allow organizations to interpret for themselves, like this is what it means in our organization, in our culture, and how we're going to sort of act on it. And so I was really excited when you said, yes, of course we should do this, and sort of leveraging your research expertise and your resources to help us find out what we found out.
Yeah, and there was really no universal standard of language. And part of it was of how much language evolves. So I wanted to pinpoint some of the research findings. So nearly all of our respondents, 97%, which is a pretty good number, said they believe that language or words can influence or reinforce power dynamics in the workplace. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you see as the influence of language on power dynamics within organizations?
Sure. So for me, like, I believe, and research sort of talks about this a lot, that language sort of shapes society and culture. And when we look at organizations, like in many ways, they're their own societies and they're building their own culture. So I think that the same way that we look at, norms across demographics and geography, we should also be thinking about institutional framing for language and how we need to think about what the cultural impact is if we do or don't sort of have some intentionality around it. And we think about the power dynamics. I don't think that people fully realize or recognize or are cognizant in our day-to-day interactions just how much power is in the words that we use and the language we use. I mean, when our former president said, shithole countries, like there's power in that. When we have a nonprofit who talks about maybe international development work that they're doing, they say, poor people or marginalized, all of those words sort of have power, and depending on who says it, the power can either be shared, or it could be sort of hierarchical. So really trying to make sure that we are constantly, constantly paying attention and having an awareness around where our words land, and then also understanding as communicators our role in the ecosystem of shaping perceptions, right? So we are often interacting with the media, and in some ways they could be using our language to sort of perpetuate certain stereotypes or modes of thinking, and then an internal culture, what is that saying to our employees, our stakeholders, our investors, et cetera? So really trying to think about what is it that we want to say, like how do we want to show up in this work, and where can we really push ourselves into discomfort of, even though this is the way we've done it all along, it's that way. And I think when we talk about like why the dynamics of power is important in language, it can become more important and more sort of valuable in actioning and accelerating progress on DEI if we were all thinking about what we want to do and how we want to use language as a tool for change.
Yeah, and even within organizations, the power differentials and what terms are used and how it's defined can have a big impact on people's advancement, people's retention, and even it seemed like we didn't see a lot of people on the same page with even what they mean by what diversity is within organizations.
Yeah, and that in and of itself was concerning, that we can have like such confusion and just lack of an understanding of terms, but everyone's using the terms all the time.
Absolutely. Okay, so in our survey, 87% said it was important to have workplace discussions about language, so nearly everybody, but only 28%, so 1 in 4, said their department or unit updates definitions in language used to talk about DE&I. Less than half of the respondents, at 48%, felt that organizations are explaining why the words that are used and the terms that are used in the workplace around DE&I are important. So why is it important for organizations and employees to talk about DE&I language in the workplace?
Well, one, you want to make sure that there's some like common understanding and framing of how you want to talk about certain things. Similar to a code of conduct or an employee handbook, there are all these rules and regulations that are created to make sure that everyone is operating in a way that reflects the organization's values. DEI language should be the same. Like, if you have a DEI statement, or if you are talking about your commitments to DEI, then you need to make sure that everyone has a shared understanding, and more importantly, that everyone has an opportunity to contribute to that. And a lot of conversations that we've had when we're creating organizational lexicons, it's not the C-suite that we are solely relying on for language. Oftentimes, they are not the best resources to help with that. And so making sure that at every level of the organization is able to share their perspective and understand like the nuances of, well, I work with this community, and so this is how we would frame it, but that may not work for these other two communities. And so really making sure that everyone is involved. And then it's really important to not be in the space of we did it and we're done, right? And so even when organizations say, yes, we're going to have these conversations, yes, we're going to create these guides and these resources, language is constantly shifting in evolving. And so organizations have to be willing to constantly evolve and review and say, the term that we used 3 years ago is no longer relevant today. Or, you know what, there's a better way to sort of talk about this. And so one of the things that I talk about with companies is this idea of innovate or follow. Oftentimes, everyone is waiting to see like who else is doing it, and then we could just follow what they do. And then sometimes that may be the route you need to take. But there's also something really special and spectacular for an organization if they're willing to innovate and say, you know what, we don't know exactly what this is, but we know we no longer want to use these terms. And so we're going to be the industry leaders and come out with the framing or at least some suggested recommendations for our organization. And I think that is how we disrupt some of the shortcomings in DEI. Like there needs to be some courage and some boldness as far as what people are willing to commit to doing.
Absolutely. And it's so critically important to have everyone on the same page. And it even expands outside DE&I. Like, how are you defining what reputation is? How does your CEO define what inclusion is within organizations, and making sure that everyone understands, like, this is what it looks like. This is how it's defined, and this is how it's codified, and this is how we apply it within our organizations. So this is a longer question because I want to give some of the data. So we did ask closed-ended questions about people's perceptions of definitions. And so in addition to asking them about like what sort of definitions they feel clarity on and what they know, we also ask them to define their terms. Like, how do you define diversity? How do you define inclusion? How do you define equity and equality and social justice in the workplace? As we identified those as sort of the most frequently used terms. And I think we also put, I know, Vanessa, you do a lot of work in social justice, but even when we were asking some of the questions, there were people who thought that was a very negative term as well, right? And you're thinking like, well, I don't even know if people know really, if you put like 10 people in a room, would you have like similar definitions of what that is? So that's one of the reasons why we got people to define it on their own. So here are some of the results that only slightly more than half of the respondents said they are comfortable with the DE&I language used in their workplace, while about that same percentage at 52% said they are clear on their workplace definitions. So when we really dug into the specific definitions, there was confusion. I mean, when we asked people like defining equity between equality, for example, they were like all over the place. It was clear there was like no similar definition. But when we asked questions, but then we also asked people, that was the qualitative part, but we also asked people to whether they understand the differences and to self-identify. So 1 in 5 said they failed to recognize the difference between diversity and inclusion. And then 1/4 said they did not understand differences between equity and equality. So what do you think is happening here?
So 2 things, but before I respond to that, I want to say the fact that there's so much confusion sort of also reflects why things have been moving so slow, right? Like if people don't understand, then how can they really take a role in creating change? And so I think that's really important to sort of like state. As far as the confusion, I think there are a couple of things. The first thing is we've been saying DEI for so long that the definition has sort of become collapsed, right? Like the term has just become like a catch-all for like anything broadly related. We have not had any sort of major moment where people have been held accountable for an understanding of that language. So when you think about it, when someone goes into an entry-level role in a PR agency, at the very least, the expectation is you do know how to, write a decent press release, or you do know how to contact, a journalist and try to get an interview. And at a mid-level, you know how to do a campaign. And at the leadership level, you're going to know how to, manage teams and all these things. Not woven into that is, but do you understand DEI, how it needs to be embedded into your work, not only as a colleague and a team player, but also into the way you are communicating, the way you're sort of talking to different audiences. There are no I haven't seen any research or haven't heard any conversations where people are saying, as part of our process, we're asking these questions. As part of our evaluation of our team, we're reviewing this. And so reflective or evidence that that is not happening is when we see some of these communications that clearly don't understand DEI, when we see like people haven't been able to effectively communicate with multicultural audiences. And so I think that we as organizations have to include as a sort of like, business driver, we are going to nurture people, train people, support people in their DEI journey, and not just as like, oh, we took an unconscious bias class, or oh, I took this training, but really making sure that it is a core function of the way the organization operates. And until that happens, and people are sort of taking a casual approach to it, there's going to continue to be the confusion.
Yeah, and I like how you talk about the casual approach versus, and you and I were talking before the call about how it's not just a one and done checkbox, that it really is something you have to devote a lot of effort to. And the Hidden Brain, the NPR podcast, had a great part about unconscious bias training and how, the results are usually, but people go back into their communities and it's sort of, the impact sort of fizzles out after you do these sort of one-offs. So that's why it has to be embedded throughout. So just for our viewing audience, we as a group, we worked with some experts to help craft language and review definitions to standardize terms. And by what I mean by experts is IPR has a Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Vanessa's part of that center. It's led by Dr. Natalie Tyndall and Emily Graham. And we had some of our members, especially we have some great rhetoricians on there who help with language, and that's really their role, who helped review some of the definitions. And then we also turned outside to CDOs and others to come up with standardized definitions for some of the terms. And as we encourage everyone, we'll drop a link in the chat to those, but we encourage everyone, you could take those definitions, make them their own. Language evolves, so feel free to, but just having some sort of resource to show everyone's on the same page is really important. Okay, so next statement. So in our research that we found that only 31% of respondents said their organization has formal definitions within DE&I. And 24% of those definitions are publicly available. So based on this, Vanessa, what do you recommend of how organizations can go about like codifying these definitions?
Well, again, I think sort of making it part of the operational or organizational, must do. So thinking about the onboarding process, like I said, you sign that code of conduct or code of ethics, making sure that there is a process in place so that everyone has an awareness of the language and how you all sort of want to interact with each other. When you think about an employee's role in an organization, the contributions to the culture, the way they speak and communicate and think about DEI has a direct impact on how they are going to do the work, right? And so that there are ways to make sure that you're embedding it into the culture. As far as creating the process is making sure that there is a consistent sort of funnel for people to share information. And so one of the previous questions was, how do we make sure that people are evolving or thinking about this? I think that having some plans, some departments, some resource who can say, hey, in our investor relations team, we're noticing these language changes. And so we want to bring these up to the organization and so people can review and we can have conversations. I think it's making space in the organization for people to have recommendations and suggestions. I think it's, we have companies who have financial audits. There should be DEI or even language audits. We do a lot of work, well, not a lot, we do some. So some of the terms that are used are in desperate need of being evolved and changed. And so one project we just completed, working with an organization where they have an internal audit now every 6 months to review language. Each department has to submit 6 of their pieces of collateral that reflect their overall messaging to see if it's meeting the standards of the organization. Representatives from each team are responsible for serving as a resource for people who do need help in using language and also understanding DEI. And so I can't sort of stress enough, like if people don't have an understanding and we're just going through the motion, nothing changes, right? And so really making sure that we are making people comfortable comfortable in what they know so that they are open to learning, and then having the tools and the checks and balances in place so that people are constantly able to evolve and to grow in this work. And I think that's the only way. But I think having continual conversations is key. I think having some documented processes. I think having people who are accountable in the organization, and then also that leadership sort of commitment to it. I'm starting to see now that there's some growing fatigue. You know, people aren't saying this publicly, but there is some fatigue. Like, haven't we done enough? We've given some money. We've made the statements. We've had town halls, and so can we get back to the business of the work? And so there's still a little bit of resistance and discomfort and sort of understanding like why this needs to be embedded into organizations and why language matters, particularly when we're thinking through the lens of communications.
So then who do you think should be so if we have people on the webinar today, some of them are chief comms officers or, executive recruiters, or they're part of associations or nonprofits. Who should take on, who should stand up and say, this is what needs to happen? Is it C-suite, HR, comms? Is it the, D&I is a separate function? What are sort of what you were seeing within organizations? So
I definitely see in some cases C-suite saying, we want to do this. And in some disappointing cases, we want to do this, but can we wrap it up in 60 days? We got other things to do. In other places, we are seeing chief diversity officers saying, we could be doing better. And then for the communications part of it, partnering with the chief communications officer or the comms team overall to say, how do we sort of create universal language for our organization? And then with the DEI folks saying, and then we'll be responsible for putting it in practice and making sure that it has a real, life cycle. And so I think that sort of having the departments working together is really helpful. I also find that sometimes people within organizations are suspicious when this work is led by comms, because they're saying oh, you all are just using all the pretty language, but the organization isn't doing anything. And so I think that that's something people should keep on their radar. It's great that we know how to talk about anything and shape perceptions and sort of shape narratives, but it means nothing if it's just flowery language or bold statements that say wow, I love what Nike said, or I love what this organization said, with no meaning behind it. So I think we need the words, but we also need the actions.
Absolutely. And the good thing about the language conversations too is that they usually spawn other conversations that are so important to have within organizations as well. And if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A, and we're happy to ask those. So Vanessa, you wrote a really great introduction in the report. If people haven't read it, they should, but it was definitely a call to action in getting the industry to do more around this. But you talked about how, we struggle to understand and evolve the language we use. And you also made a point that, it isn't about shaming or saying you haven't done this, but it's more about getting people to pay attention to it. Now everyone's on notice because we're doing this webinar. But one recommendation you gave is for communicators to pay strategic attention. I put that in quotes because that's your words, to how language is used to create clarity and consistency, and also how important it is that employees must be involved throughout this whole process. Do you have anything to add or anything you want to say about that?
Yes. So I think the framing to me for that letter, and just what I think we should do, is thinking about it as an opportunity, right? We have an opportunity to really shift the way organizations are functioning, to shift the way we're thinking about something really important, to shift the way people feel included in an environment and that they belong. I think that's exciting and it's possible, right? So we've been talking about DEI in the PR sector for a really long time. We have more data than we know what to do with. And so now I think that we should be in the phase of doing and looking at the opportunity. And I think that so often what we're seeing, and when I talk about the strategic sort of direction, often because people don't want to make mistakes, because they don't want to get it wrong, we're taking very small, tactical, safe steps, as opposed to taking big, bold, disruptive steps and then figuring it out from there. Like it's bad already, right? And so I think that if we are in agreement that we want to do something great, let's take some big bold steps and see what sticks and where we land, and sort of think about what the opportunity is to improve the sector and to have more people engaged and aware of just the power of language and the words that we're using. And again, we are writing, annual reports and press releases and op-eds and all of these things like that. Our words are everywhere. And so how do we make sure that we are communicating through a lens of DEI that really reflects the way we want people to be seen, like our sort of appreciation and respect for all of humanity? I just think that's really important.
So you did mention taking like big, bold steps, and you may not be able to name any companies, but have you seen any like really good actions that you've seen some companies maybe engage in that are, that you're like, wow, that really is being radical and taking a really strong stance moving forward?
I wouldn't say bold industry-wide, but maybe bold within their smaller subset. So again, we work primarily with the nonprofit and social innovation space. And so I have seen some organizations that have historically been charged with having terrible sort of appreciation for DEI and the language that the sector used. And so really like calling themselves out on their journey and documenting it so that others will be able to learn from it. And so that's the other thing that I find, because people don't feel like their organizations have done a good job. We're doing a lot of things like in secret. And so like, we don't want to tell our story. We don't want anyone to know that we've made these horrible mistakes. But really part of the advancement, I think the acceleration of the advancement is share it. It's already done and people already know, right? Like even if you don't think they know, people know. And so what would happen if we are like open sourcing, like all of the things that we got right on this journey and all the things that we got wrong? I think that will also help others to have some confidence in how they move forward. So I've seen organizations that have really engaged every level of the organization and given power to those who are like closer to the issues. I've seen them documenting it, internally and then publicly to sort of share like, hey, learn from our mistakes. I see a lot of financial commitments in meaningful ways. So not just throwing money at the problem, but where do we put this money where it's going to create some learnings and then also an opportunity to maybe grow in the places where we as an organization have been slow. And then the other thing that I think has been really bold is to think about the amount of responsibility that we're putting on people of color in this work. I think that there is something courageous in saying like, we don't know the answers. We think you know the answers, but we don't want to overly burden you. So like, how do we figure out what the shared experience looks like? And to me, that feels radical because historically it's been like, oh, let's ask all the Black people to figure this out or the brown people to figure this out. And that is not going to get us to the solution that's needed.
Right. And it doesn't help the mental health impact either, right? And something like documentation is simple. You can, regardless of your budget or what resource, like documenting is an important step. And I think it aligns very well with the definitions and the language, making sure we're all on the same page. I think that's really important. So let's talk about words versus actions. I'm sure you've seen some experience with that. So one of the other areas that we studied that was really important is to look at, because especially after George Floyd's murder, we saw a lot of companies, put up the black box statements with the white font about how important DE&I was to their organizations and the change that we're going to make. But at the same time, you also saw some companies that what they were saying externally wasn't actually what was happening internally or how employees felt included. And you also mentioned the term belonging. And that was something we also talked about in the study, that we do see that as a separate, this is for the viewing audience, not for Vanessa, she knows this, that we do see inclusion and belonging as different terms and they may be nuanced, but it is definitely like include versus if you feel like you belong. So check that out in the study. But in our study, 3/4 of respondents said that the company was more likely to express a commitment to DE&I. But then when we ask questions about, okay, well, does your company take actions? That number, of course, fell. 70% said their company does take actions internally, but then 59% said that their company engages in more activities externally on societal level. So as you said, like there's a gap between even what people are doing in practice and how they're communicating that out. So clearly there's a disconnect, and it's not a big surprise that people feel like their organization is more likely to publicly engage in statements rather than take actions. Are you seeing more clients backing up statements with actions, or where are we, with that a year and a half post George Floyd?
So first, I want to say that all of my clients are doing amazing.
And your future clients will do it.
Yes, and our future clients. I do find that, as I said earlier, people are fizzling out, feeling like, okay, we've righted the ship, or at least calmed the waters, and not really moving with the same level of intensity as we saw earlier. Like, I think that people felt so much public and internal pressure to say something, do something, that they didn't have a choice. And as you mentioned, many companies have sort of continued to take action, but there are also a lot who have sort of, gone back to business as normal. Even in the nonprofit world and philanthropy, there's been reports that talked about like some large commitments that were made to certain types of organizations for racial justice or funding of Black and Brown entrepreneurs. And when you sort of like dissect like what was really given, it didn't really equate to like the big, bold, multi-billion-dollar numbers that people had pledged. So I think that there are a lot of people who made, or a lot of organizations that made pledges and commitments and did not, unfortunately, follow them through. I think that may also be part of the contributing factors to like the Great Resignation, why people are like, well, I don't want to be associated with this company. And so I do think that we will continue to hear employees sort of outing their employers about, this is not a place that people want to work, this is how we're being treated, until there is some change. So I think that companies are not going to be able to like get off of the hook. I think that they will continue to sort of, hear from internal and external resources and exposés and people sharing, leaking emails and things like that until something changes.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to ask you one more question. That won't be my last question, but one more question right now, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. I see we have a couple already. All right, so we did ask questions, and we talked about this briefly earlier about where the diversity initiatives are located within organizations. 35% said it was a standalone department, and 38% said human resources. We also asked a question about the relationship between the communication function, wherever the diversity function is housed within organizations. 80% of respondents said the communication function worked somewhat or very closely with the diversity function, wherever it was stationed. What are the lessons learned here, especially as we have a lot of communicators on the call? So let's start with that, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question to that.
What are the lessons learned?
Yeah, like what does it tell you about, well, let me ask you the next question, and then maybe a little too. How important then is it where the DE&I function sits within an organization? And do you have any recommendations about that?
Well, first, I want to say having a DEI function that has some power is important, right? So there are a lot of DEI roles that are powerless, and so there's no movement, there's nothing happening. So I think if you are going to have a DEI function, then you need to give them some power and some autonomy to get some things done. I think that it is important to have it, and I think having it at the C level with some other resources to do different kinds of work, because it's a lot to it. You're looking at the external piece, the internal piece, the culture, sort of the shifting of an organization and who it knows itself to be. All of that requires time, money, people to sort of restructure and reshift the organization. I do think, as far as what I've seen most effective, is even if the CEO doesn't fully understand or know what to do, but having a CEO who is willing to have the hard conversations and make the decisions to change the organization, and is making sure that every level of the organization is responsible for moving forward this way, that is incredibly helpful, because I've seen a number of CEOs who are resistant to this work, who are like, having to be convinced. I was having a conversation with someone maybe 6 or 7 months ago, and they asked if I could have a conversation with some members of their leadership team to sort of explain the business drivers for DEI. And I was like, anybody who needs to have that conversation needs to just get voted off the island, right? We're so past that. And so, but that's the reality. And so really making sure that, that function exists and is able to do the work that they're being asked to do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, excuse me, what you said about reporting structures, because I've seen such a mix. Like even if you do have the diversity, it's a separate function, you have a CDO, who that CDO reports to, right? That also tells you how important it is within the organization, or if they have a budget or even resources to be able to. So I think that's really important, the power piece. All right, so let's also open it up for questions. Okay, so Pat, I'll just call people's names because Pat Ford. So he wants to know, what is your reaction to a new study released yesterday, and how those who want to show respect to certain communities should interpret this data? So this is the headline from Diversity Inc. That new poll reveals 40% of Hispanic and Latin individuals are bothered or offended by the term Latinx. So do you want to talk about maybe some of the terms that we even describe to people? And so what are your thoughts about that?
Yes. So thank you for sharing that. When I heard that they were bothered, it's not new or surprising. It is an ongoing conversation. And so I remember someone on Instagram, maybe a year or so ago, with a post that said, what was the committee that decided on Latinx, right? Like, so it's like, my grandmother wasn't there, my mother wasn't there, I wasn't there. And so I think that there are these, it was met with mixed reviews, although we've sort of universally adopted it. But I think it points to just an incredible, or gives us an incredible reminder of the nuance of language. It doesn't have to be an end all be all, not a one size fits all. And then also making sure that we are constantly checking in the people that we are speaking about, the people, places, or things, to make sure that that reflects the experience that they want to put forth. And so I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all. I don't know if we'll go back to anything different, but I'm not surprised.
Right. It's like, well, then, right. So it's finding out what is the term
that
people in the group want to be called, not what external people want to be called. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So John Morley asked, did you see any information on the value of engaging employees in what to communicate about, as well as how to communicate it? I botched the question. Let me redo the question, Vanessa. Did you see any information on the value of engaging employees in the what to communicate about, as well as how to communicate about it?
So I did not see it, but I will say, just based on what was described in the question, like any organization that is not engaging their employees is in trouble, right? I don't know how you can continue to exist and be successful. So I think engaging employees, we are now entering, or like at the first level of new power in organizations, right? So the old power is the C-suite makes all the decisions. That's very hierarchical. You're going to do what I say. You're not going to ask any questions. And if you want to keep your job, that's that. In the sort of shared power scenario, you are engaging every level of the organization to be part of the decision making, right? You have the wisdom to know that the people who are closest to the problem are often closest to the solution, and that's going to make you more money and more successful than you could possibly dream of. And so I think that it is just very short-sighted to not think about the many ways that you can engage your employees, and then also thinking about who often gets the least amount of engagement, right? So we know that when we're talking about leadership, like you've done studies about like women in thought leadership, people of color, really thinking about have we integrated all of the other groups who typically or traditionally in the workplace have been excluded? And when we talk about like what bold steps can people do, like, oh, I'm going to now turn to the people who have been silenced or who haven't had a seat at the table to be able to tell their experience to see how that can help to make our organization more healthy, more sound, and more forward thinking.
Yes, and just to add on to that, one thing is that when Vanessa and I were looking at the qualitative responses, there were people who said, I am really disappointed that my organization has not had these conversations with us. And I'm disappointed that we don't have this, or it was something that was discussed briefly within their like employee orientation, but then it wasn't. After that, it was just sort of dissipated. And plus, Vanessa also made a point about, it's not that it's also important to recognize the intersectionality of people and their experiences. So whether it's race, or you're a woman, or you're LGBTQ plus, or you have a disability or accessibility, all those are part of it. And in the study, we did ask about what does your organization prioritize? And race and gender were at the top, but there were some others at the bottom that definitely need attention, like accessibility and disabilities, and that are really important to recognize as well. So you can check that out in the report. Okay, so there are, I'm going to ask more questions.
Sure.
An anonymous attendee asked, can you talk about how DE&I work, specifically around inclusivity, may be done at smaller organizations that lack a diverse range of employees compared to larger ones? So how can you do stuff at smaller organizations to make an impact?
So I think that any organization can do something. And I think inclusivity can start with just people being mindful of their typical frame of reference. So years ago, when I worked on Wall Street, I was part of a conversation that probably I should not have been, where a senior leader talked about during the interview process that he typically hires people who are just like him. He was like, I don't mean to, but there's just a comfort level. People who have, gone to the same schools, we could talk about the same things. And so if I have a qualified Black candidate and a white candidate who have similar backgrounds, I'm more than likely going to go with the white candidate because it's just familiar to me. Appreciate his honesty, saddened by the reality, right? And so I think if we can just sort of work through, like, wait a minute, how do we sort of self-regulate? Am I choosing the right person because this feels comfortable and familiar? What am I looking at? What criteria am I using to judge people? I noticed that in meetings, this person is usually quiet. Are we giving this person space to share their opinions and their ideas? Are there responsibilities that we can give them? Just really simple, basic things that make someone feel included and that they belong. And I think that that's just an easy first step. Other parts of it is thinking about hiring processes, or our RFPs are a good one. I have been like, hell no RFPs, because one, I hate them, but also I've been talking to clients about, does your RFP process exclude smaller vendors, right, who don't have the big machines? And so are you maybe excluding women-owned businesses, solo entrepreneurs, people of color who may not have the same resources? So thinking about all of the different places and ways, the different places and ways that the organization may have been focusing on systems that were oppressive, and how can we change that? John, the statute of limitations has expired.
John asked, when's the lawsuit? So yeah, about that. I think those are all really great suggestions. And, Zoom's been a good equalizer, but then I think another question moving forward, inclusivity piece, that if you are a small organization and you have people showing up in the office and people work remotely, how do you make sure that everyone's getting equal opportunities and that there's equity involved in all sorts of other areas? One of the areas that we're also thinking about doing research on and talking about is equity. So Kaylin Hicks, who is our LeGrant Fellow, when he surveyed people about, he did a scale and organization inclusive and belonging, like a great study for diversity. Like half of the respondents said their organization doesn't have a plan in place for pay equity, to making sure that people are paid, for their jobs and where they are in positions. I mean, that's something simple that all organizations can do regardless of the size. Okay, so Dr. Nika Logan, who helped us construct the definition. So hello, Nika. Hi, Nika. We're gonna, she has a question. She says she likes the distinction between righting the ship versus calming the waters. Hold on, let me move this up so I can read it. Can you talk a bit more about when to use each one, righting the ship versus calming the waters, as a strategy, and how these might be two sides of the same coin?
Great question, Nika. So I think that righting the ship is when there's like total pandemonium. There is no DEI foundation in the organization. It just hasn't been part of what the organization has prioritized. And so there is no sort of diversity within the ranks. There is clear power dynamics or exclusion to different people of color and other groups, when there is no checks and balance about like the communications that are happening in an organization. So there's constant having to defend or apologize after the fact for like, oh, we didn't mean to say that, or that's not what we meant. And we've seen that across the board, right? Like the Pepsi commercial, H&M, like, oh, we didn't mean that. That's sort of reflective of not having the right people in the room. As far as calming the waters is, it could be that feeling of impatience where an organization is moving slower than people want. People feeling like, oh, are they doing this just because they're being pressured to, versus it being a business imperative and them wanting to. And I think in some ways, Nika, yes, it is sort of two sides of the same coin, but I think that there's much more at stake when you're trying to right the ship, because if you continue to go in the wrong direction and get lost, it's over. Versus calming the waters, there are many things, maybe everything else is working well, but it's just sort of like calming the waters to sort of get everything back on track. And I think that a lot of the organizations sometimes have been, I've seen organizations who have been in a place where like, oh, we just need to calm the waters, and then they don't act, and then they then have to right the ship. So I think there is a consequence to not righting, sort of calming the waters, and a bigger consequence when you don't right the ship.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vanessa. So I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you. How would you recommend a non-diverse communications team with no near-term ability to hire additional staff make sure they are properly representing a diverse audience in a company?
That is a wonderful question. And I just have to say, asking that question gives me hope. So thank you. I think first, something as simple as looking at some of the language and terms that are used to communicate. So, using, like I said, I used marginalized earlier, poverty and poor, like whatever sector you're in, what is the most evolved language to represent that sector? The second thing would be thinking about, how do you want to communicate? So I often talk about this idea of representation of humanity. When I'm working with like students or entry-level people at my agency, I talk to them about, how do you sort of create the most respectful communications that shows that you see the humanity in others? You don't have to know what my experience is. I don't have to know what your experience is to know that I want to be respectful, right? That I want to take the time to understand what's going to be the best reflection of you. And I think just sort of taking that step back and not assuming that the way that's always been done is the way that's going to work now. I also think that even if you don't have the resources in place, that there is training that one can do on their own. So, looking at other publications or other resources to see how other people are writing about things or actioning them. Maybe having some system in place at the organization where maybe, everything that is written gets checked by someone else to say like, between the two of us, we think that this is okay based on these three things. Maybe have some kind of checklist that talks about does it meet this criteria? Have we checked these words? Could this be misinterpreted? What is our intention here? And so I think like being in a space of slowing down until it becomes sort of second nature could be really valuable. And as
Yes.
Pat Ford said, hire the Wakeman agency. Like that's saying, all of your problems, hire the Wakeman agency.
Well, I was going to say, like, even having somebody do contract work. I mean, I think we have a diverse team. And we do have people on our staff who do review materials before it goes out, just as an extra check and balance. But, if there's employee resource groups or even just hiring a contractor, because I think for me personally, it really is important to have that voice represented on communications, both internally and externally. So Gloria asked, what are examples of feedback loops in organizations that you have seen that have been successful?
So I think some organizations have done some anonymous reporting to make sure that people felt that there would be no consequences for them sharing information. I've seen that be effective. There have been DEI committees where representation from different departments or parts of the organization gets to sort of report up things. And so people go to their local or their departmental DEI representative and say, like, these are the things that are happening in the organization. This is what I'm seeing, or we need to get ahead of this. And I think also, just having constant communication. So one of our clients, once a month in their staff meeting, they dedicate half of the meeting to going into breakouts to sort of discussing, like, what did we learn new about DEI? The first couple of meetings were silent. It was like we were at a silent retreat. Like nobody wanted to say anything. There was a lot of discomfort, and people did not have, there were concerns that this was going to go nowhere. So like, why should I get excited and engage and not knowing that they're really going to do something with this? And then we created a roadmap to sort of show like, okay, these are the things that have been brought up, and this is the organization's commitment to sort of, if not being able to solve it, being able to provide some incremental updates in this frequency. And then people start to get into it because they saw that there was some progress. So having that action and that shared responsibility for it was really helpful. But I think sort of meeting as groups, meeting as teams, meeting across teams, sort of seeing like if you're in investor relations and someone else is in external communications or internal, or even in the programs or a different department, having people to come together to sort of share what they're seeing in their area. And then always sort of some assurances from the C-suite to talk about the appreciation for this, right? Like ultimately this is the CEO's responsibility. And so this DEI work, if you're not in a DEI role, is often like extracurricular. And so really having an appreciation for people contributing beyond what is required of them in their job, I think is really important.
Great. Okay, so I think we have time for one more. For companies that have a staff made up of a broad range of generations and political beliefs, so a lot of differing opinions, what are ways we can engage with the entire staff without causing internal strife?
So no such thing, I'm sorry. I think I think the generational question or concern is really important because different generations sort of look at different problems in different ways. Or different sort of issues and prioritize them differently. I think it's important to allow people the space to be with where they are, but also not allowing them to stay there, so that they have to evolve to meet sort of what the company is. And so I think understanding like, okay, this person has had this thinking or has operated in the world in this way. And so tomorrow they're not going to be a different individual, but part of the rules and engagement in this organization requires that at least while you're here, you're going to treat people with respect, you're going to have an open mind, you're going to be using this language, you're going to make sure that you are playing the role that allows you to stay employed here. And so I think that there will be strife, there will be resistance, there will be discomfort. And I think like companies don't want to hear this, but some people will need to leave, right? Like if you're really committed to this work, not everyone is going to go along as like a happy participant. And so it does allow you to sort of, point out the people who no longer represent the values of your organization and give them the opportunity to find someone that is, an organization that fits them. But I don't think that trying to make everyone feel like comfortable and like, oh, it's okay that you feel that belief that is in 100% contrast to everything we stand for. Like that's not someone I would want in my organization. So I think creating that tension in a way to move forward is necessary.
Yes, and just on a anecdotal note, when we did this study, Vanessa knows this. We do tons of surveys and studies, but it's when we focus on DE&I, we get like people calling us names and like you're just trying to we were called socialist and like Marxist. I mean, all sorts of. It's really interesting. I mean, it's a small number, but we don't get that when we do a study on disinformation. So it's really interesting how some people, not interesting, it's really just shocking how some people get very uncomfortable with the topic itself. So. Okay, so Vanessa, we're not going to be able to get to every question, but I get to ask the last question as your partner. So here we go. Where do we go from here? What would you recommend? What's the overall, where do we go from here? What are our next steps?
Sure. So I would say the next step is to continue talking, but only talking if there's a willingness for deliberate action, right? So I think that just as human beings, we're very good about thinking through things and talking through them and like having fire in our belly, but not putting action to it. And so deliberate action is really important. I think that I would like for everyone to sort of walk away thinking about what is their personal responsibility to this. And so we can say that it is an organizational challenge or something for an organization to solve, and that's 100% correct. But if you are part of that organization, that means that you are part of that solve. I think that thinking about like your own ability to be an ally or an accomplice is like an easy step within an organization that could maybe help someone else. That sometimes people don't even think about that. Like, what can I do? I don't have power. But depending on where you sit in the like wheel of privilege, there's someone somewhere that you can be helpful to. As far as the language, I think that taking accountability or sort of holding yourself to a standard of how you want to communicate is really important. And then also continuing the push for organizations. Like I said, people are feeling fatigued and like, oh, we've already done that. And this work is never done, right? Until we have full equity and everyone feels like when Tina does her next survey and everyone says 100%, I feel like I belong. There's equity and inclusivity in my organization, like this continues. And we're a long way from there. And I think continuing to have these conversations and asking the questions is really important.
Absolutely. I wanted to thank you, Vanessa, for spending the time with us today and being a great partner on this report. It was a pleasure working with you and your team.
You too.
And I think it's a really important report as well that hopefully will help make a difference in our profession. So this is recorded. We will put it on for playback on our website and send it out to everyone who registered. I wanted to thank Vanessa for being here today, and I wanted to thank each and every one of you for being here today. And I hope everyone has a fantastic holiday. So thank you all.
Thank you, Tina.
Bye.